Okay, hello and welcome to this event on reaching net zero, public opinion on eliminating greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This is a Bright Blue event in partnership with Cadent Gas. Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. Their research focuses on domestic, social, educational, environmental and economic policy. We ask that you tweet using the hashtag reaching net zero, and you can follow at We Are Bright Blue and Cadent Gas Limited. You can ask questions for our panelists throughout today on Slido using the code net0. I will introduce our panelists as we go along, and they will be answering some questions, including what views do the British public hold on the credibility of and responsibility for reaching the 2050 net zero target? Does the public have preferences on broad policy approaches to net zero? How does the public perceive the role of government and businesses in achieving the net zero target? Does the transition of the energy sector face particular challenges in regard to public opinions? And which issues might make the British public less receptive of the efforts to reach the net zero target? And what is the role of policymakers and businesses in ensuring the public supports the transition to net zero? First up, we have Kwasi Kwarteng MP, who is Minister of State at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Minister, if you'd like to kick us off.
Look, there were lots of questions there. I mean, my approach will be just to talk about what I think, how things have changed, how the debate has moved on in the last 5 years. I think there's much more growing awareness of what net zero means, decarbonisation, what that means. But having said that, there's still a long way to go in terms of getting the public on side behind the decarbonisation agenda. If you look at the last general election in 2019, it was the first time that I felt that the net zero climate change issue was actually raised on people's doorsteps. It was something that I hadn't seen before. I've been a candidate, I think, in 5 general elections, and this was the first time that some people were actively engaged with the issue. The other thing I would say is that if we look at the big successes that we've had in decarbonisation, the power sector and electricity generation is the outstanding arena, if you like, the outstanding area where decarbonisation has been most successful. And in that, I'm very pleased to say that offshore wind has been a massive success. I've just come from a panel which was virtual, but was hosted in Hamburg for EU countries, particularly players as well in the offshore wind sector. Companies like RWE from Germany, Ørsted, which is a Danish company. And they were amazed and expressed real gratitude. And they were impressed at the fact that the UK today has 35% of the installed global offshore wind capacity. And I think generally, if you look at polls on offshore wind, something like 80% of the public are broadly in favor of offshore wind. And this is a public, after all, that many of whom will remember the coal miners' strike. They'll remember the fact that coal was a huge part of the Industrial Revolution and also of our industrial and political life until only about 30, 40 years ago. And so there's been a massive shift in the British public's mind, I think. I think there's still a long way to go, but broadly, I think it's very positive. Now, the big debate is whether we should be moving faster and quicker, and I can understand why people like Extinction Rebellion, people like Greenpeace, people like Friends of the Earth want to push us even more quickly. But of course, if you're in government, you've got to try and bring the public with you. And actually, I think that the course that we're plotting at the moment balances the need for urgency and the more radical, our more radical friends, and also the public, a large portion of whom still remain. I wouldn't say indifferent, but they remain less engaged with the quest to net zero. So I'll leave it there.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, really interesting on the question of whether the public is up for the pace of change that some people think that we need. Okay, well, next we'll hear from Richard Howard, who is the research director of Aurora, the energy consultancy. Richard.
Thanks. Yes, I'll focus on two of the questions that you asked, Emma, on what's the opinion of the British public on the credibility and responsibility for the 2050 net zero target? And then are there any areas in which there are particular challenges in relation to decarbonisation and public opinion? And there I'd like to focus on the heat sector as being a particular challenge. So to me, I mean, as Minister Kwarteng said, there is more and more support and engagement from the general public in these issues around decarbonisation, and it became actually a really big issue for the last election. But I would strongly sort of reiterate what he was saying in terms of bringing people along with us. I firmly believe that we need to try and do this in the most in a way that's affordable, and particularly for poorer households, and is also affordable for business. But to me, there's this kind of always a dichotomy in this debate where lots of people express support for net zero, but in general, as a general idea, when you actually get down into the nitty gritty, there is less and less support for some of the more significant changes that people might have to make in order for us to get there. So although people support the general idea, they then also tend to try and sort of deflect that to say government should do X, Y, and Z, big energy companies should do X, Y, and Z. And they take some people, if you look at the polling data from the work that Bright Blue's done, and also the work of the Citizens Assembly on climate change, that is a message that comes through sort of time and time again, that people like the idea of it, but actually struggle with some of the more significant changes that they would have to do personally for us to get there. So people tend to be in favour of doing some more recycling, putting some loft insulation in their roof, but have they really thought through things like, you know, switching from a gas boiler to a hydrogen boiler or a heat pump? Have they really thought about whether they're prepared to fly less or eat less red meat in order to deliver net zero? Some people will. There are lots of enthusiasts out there and people who are totally dedicated. This is like a personal mission for them. But the question is whether there is broad support for that across the population as a whole, because ultimately it's us as citizens, as individuals, as consumers and taxpayers. We will all need to change some things in order to get to net zero. So that's my sort of general thesis about the overall sort of credibility and responsibility. On the question of, you asked the question of where do we face particular challenges, and I would call out heat decarbonisation as being more challenging, arguably the most challenging part of this overall plan. And so as Minister Kwarteng said, we've made massive progress on the power sector. We've built a lot of wind farms, offshore wind farms. We're world leader in that, and we're going to build a whole lot more. Boris Johnson's targeting 40 gigawatts, which is a huge aspiration. But this only cuts away at the emissions in the power sector. Yes, we'll electrify some more things. We'll switch to EVs. To me, the really difficult problem is around how we decarbonize heating. And this is a very different problem. It involves interventions in people's homes, first and foremost, which people are not necessarily comfortable with. That's different from what's happened in power. We're coming from a starting point where 85% of households use gas. They know it, they understand it, it's really, really cheap, and it delivers heating quickly. And that's what people know and understand. So asking people to shift towards alternative sources such as heat pumps or hydrogen boilers will be a challenge. Partly because of the lack of familiarity that comes through in the polling data, partly because those technologies are just more expensive, partly also because in my mind there's a bit of a policy gap here. We have a heat strategy, it's a number of years old now, and that focused very much on the electrification of heating. And the government is rewriting its heat strategy, but we've heard today or in recent days that it might be delayed for a further year. So there isn't a sort of a super clear plan for actually how we're going to get to net zero in heating. And the government has said we're going to do trials of hydrogen and rolling that out to the size of a town by 2030, which I personally think is a great idea that we're trialing the technology. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of heat pumps deployed per annum by that same date, but that doesn't represent a sort of complete decarbonisation plan for heating. So to me, that's where there's still quite a policy gap, and maybe that contributes to the fact that the general population isn't really clear on the plan and isn't really sort of totally behind the plan, as it were, on the heat side. So to me, that's the biggest challenge in all of this, in bringing people along. I'll end there.
Great, thank you, Richard. I saw someone tweet recently about how their air heat pump was particularly unattractive. I wonder if there's a kind of effort to make things much more kind of appealing and accessible to consumers. So just a reminder that you can ask questions. Please do ask questions via Slido using the code NET0. So next we're going to hear from Dr. David Reiner, who's a senior lecturer in technology policy at the Cambridge Judge Business School.
Thank you, Emma. So first of all, I wanted to give a vote of thanks. I think it's great that Bright Blue has been doing work in this area, something that we've been actively working on at Cambridge. I think others, such as the Energy Systems Catapult and others, have been doing this work. I would note that the Committee on Climate Change, which has done this kind of wonderful kind of the path-breaking work on net zero, arguably this is one area where they I think maybe haven't done enough work, and I think it's sort of critical going forward that they do. But I wanted to draw maybe on two main points. One is about kind of the danger of what you might call pseudo opinions, and the second is the tension between kind of our own attitudes as citizens and as consumers. So, I'm someone that kind of commissions and analyzes many of these surveys, and the danger about asking about an unfamiliar concept, such as net zero, is that, my social psychologist colleagues call these pseudo opinions. The Bayes tracker shows that awareness of net zero has gone up from 50% in March to 2/3 in October. But those are essentially anybody who's even vaguely heard of the concept. When you actually drill down and ask who knows a little bit about it, you only see that number kind of increasing from, say, 13% to 18%. And so the danger is that you end up drawing inferences from increasingly detailed questions of which people are only vaguely aware. As a point of comparison, energy performance certificates were introduced in 2007, and the latest Bayes tracker shows that about 3/4 of the British public are aware of these ratings, but only about 6% actually know the EPC rating of their own home.
Yeah.
So that's a big, I think, question or challenge going forward.
So, anyway.
And then the other, so Minister, do you want to come in? Or?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that's a very good point.
And then the other question is kind of this tension between consumers and citizens. And in the polling booth, and answering polls, we might have one attitude, but when we actually have to reach into our pocket, we might have a very different view. And I think the Bright Blue study shows this. We find this in some of our work. Layered upon that, and I think Richard already alluded to this, is the fact that many people don't know about these technologies. So I think 40% had said they had even heard of heat pumps, let alone kind of being willing to install one in their own home. Another challenge, of course, is that people don't recognize that gas is a problem in meeting net zero. So I think, again, the Bright Blue study found that only 16% of the British public consider gas to, for home heating to be a significant source of emissions. So, so I think that will lead to a very difficult question, which is the tolerance for price rises. Currently, the VAT for gas heating in the home is 5%, which is the same category as child safety harnesses and smoking cessation and other good things. And the logical thing to do would be to consider raising VAT, but the tolerance for that might be very different from kind of vague words of positivity regarding net zero and decarbonizing heat. Another area, I think, which we've also started to look at is the willingness of the public consumers to pay for decarbonized products. things like plastic bottles that are produced without CO2 emissions. So, we did an experiment which shows that, the public, at least theoretically, is willing to pay maybe twice as much for a decarbonized plastic bottle as a regular one. Now the question is, will the producers believe that, and will consumers actually follow through? So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. And then a final point is work that BEIS has commissioned to look at kind of regional attitudes within clusters. So I think another really important thing to move beyond kind of attitudes of the general public is to understand which consumers, which groups, and which regions or sub-regions might actually stand to either benefit or suffer from this shift towards net zero. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. And I think that kind of starts to hint at some of kind of the politics of this and how we decide who we're trying to appeal to here. Okay, I'd like to next go to Dr. Tony Balance, who is the Chief Regulation Officer at Cadent Gas.
Yeah, good afternoon all, and thanks, David. That's a nice segue from you and Richard, as heat is a critical area of decarbonisation. And I guess, many of you will know I work for Cadent Gas, which is the largest of the UK's gas distribution businesses. And we run 4 of the networks supplying roughly half of the 22 million customers. It's 11 million customers in all with gas. And the last 9 months or so since I've been in the business have been a real, I think, whirlwind of activity, relentlessly kind of looking at the implications of net zero on our business. And quite frankly, we don't have a business in 20 or so years' time unless there's some alternative for natural gas. And I think it's worth saying up front that we very much welcome the clarity that the government's 10-point plan has brought, and the need now to demonstrate hydrogen as a workable vector in the kind of energy and heating mix. And I think we know now that the ball is in our court to demonstrate that hydrogen is technically feasible and safe, and of course economic and ultimately good for customers. And I think it's worth saying we've also been looking more and more on what net zero and the transition to new heating systems in the home ultimately means for our customers. And heating is a very important but tricky area for decarbonisation. I think we all recognise that. I think we believe it's critical to understand more and more how we might make the journey from now to net zero as seamless as possible for our customers, as well as affordable. Now, I think it's not so long ago it would have not been obvious for a gas distribution company like Cadent or whoever to be talking about its customers. But I think times have changed. I think we're all now acutely aware of the legitimacy that big business needs to have, particularly a monopoly business in the private sector. And that means running our business in the long-term interests of customers. Now, much of the economics of future energy use points to kind of balanced scenarios in the form of heat pumps and hydrogen as being the most economic solution. But the economics, I don't think, is definitive. And I don't really have time to talk about that today because I want to get on to the customer piece. And what doesn't really feature in the economic studies, other than to say, well, gas boilers, replacing them for hydrogen boilers like for like at cost is much cheaper than, say, moving to a heat pump. It doesn't really get under the skin of the customer journey. Now, it's important, I think, to say that Chris Stark from the CC has made the point that the system costs don't really represent a significant differentiator in these different scenarios. It's going to be likely that public opinion will define the ultimate shape of our decarbonised future. Hence, the need to look at customers and their views in respect of things like hydrogen. Now, as I say, I've not been in the sector very long. I think one of the things that struck me a while ago was the Citizens Advice Report, Taking the Temperature, which talked critically, and I'll read the quote out. Crucially, people want a warm and comfortable home with a heating system that is affordable to run while being responsive and reliable. So there's a few things in there about reasonable temperature, responsiveness, manageable costs, and reliability. And I guess this piqued our interest and led us want to find out more for our future plans, building on the research that we've done recently for our price review with Ofgem. We knew that customers didn't know much about net zero. Other speakers have commented on that. But we wanted to know more. And the Going Greener report, importantly for Cadent, focused in on decarbonising heat and looked at how people use their heating system currently and what they'd want from their heating system moving forwards. So the report, I think, told us a few things. I think it confirmed things that we already knew. Generally, the UK public accept the need to change, and indeed they support the UK's 2050 net zero targets. But as others have said, there's very little understanding of the impact on the environment from domestic heating, and even less understanding on how change might actually impact them. And it's also worth, I think, recognise that installation costs are widely seen as the most significant blocker to any change. The report, I think, also enhanced our understanding in one or two areas. We heard loud and clear that factors such as disruption, control and reliability are all seen as very important to customers in some cases, and just as important or more important than cost. The research also enhanced our understanding of the level of choice that customers expect in deciding their future heating solutions. But what is most interesting is a few new insights. One was around kind of lack of information in this area. Customers have a thirst for that. And I think the report also provided us with essential evidence to develop a number of hypotheses, which we've since tested. Disruption is an important factor, and that means different things to different people. It means time off from your gas supply, any changes that you might make to your energy solution, and any change in the functionality from their current heating solution. So I think we need to get under the skin of what disruption means. I think it goes without saying that customers love their central heating solution. So we've got to do some work about understanding how that switch is going to take place on a like-for-like basis. I think the research also allows us to see attitudes and preferences change depending on certain social demographic characteristics. And again, we've been able to build on this and have confirmed it's actually tenure more than any other factor that drives different opinions. Other factors such as the type of property don't really say very much. Conscious I'm running out of time, I think there's a lot more work to do around understanding customer journeys. What happens in the transition from one system to another? Do customers like their heat pumps? If not, what are the factors in that? So there's lots more work that we're keen to do to understand much better that customer journey and how we can help pave the way and, as I say, make that journey as seamless as possible. I'll stop there, conscious of time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. I think the kind of need to kind of inform the public about all of this is kind of a big theme that we are seeing today. So next we will hear from Anvar Sarigulov, who is a senior research fellow at Bright Blue.
Hello. Well, I think I'm going to echo quite a bit of what's been said just now, and I'll start with reiterating the good news is that from our research, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit and borrow quite a bit from Going Greener, the public is broadly receptive of a variety of measures and by governments and businesses and individual interventions to help along with the path of net zero. So there's something to really build upon, Sean. And I think what's even better is that it's not a partisan issue. People think about green politics as sometimes quite driven by kind of like young, liberal, metropolitan groups, but actually we find wide range of support and consensus even among groups who would expect to be a bit more skeptical, Leave voters, conservatives. So that together suggests that there's a lot of space for action, effective action. But along with the good news is the bad news, and that is that the public is sensitive to cost, as being reiterated and pointed out by both Richard and David, and that once you start getting into kind of like the details, the nitty-gritty details, the losers and the winners, the awareness of costs creates quite a high potential of opposition towards specific measures. So it's kind of a key challenge for policymakers to address that, really, and to think about how to address those costs, particularly among the more skeptical groups. To go a bit broader into the partisanship, I think what's important to reiterate is that we find support for quite radical policies on a broad level, even among, for example, conservatives. So, for example, carbon tax, which we asked in quite a generic way, and of course, if you were to get into details of a carbon tax, you'd probably get quite a bit more opposition. But a generic carbon tax question received 45% support from conservative voters versus 90% opposition. So there is definitely kind of like a latent desire for some action, and potentially radical action. And I think the public also recognizes that it is quite a big it's a big climb, and there's recognition 58% of people attribute a lot of responsibility to basically every major part of society, government, businesses, individuals. So it's kind of an all recognition that's an all hands on deck thing. But there are limitations to this understanding, which have kind of been commented upon. And I think the interesting prime example from our research is the fact that, like, the first thing, that the most notable thing for people about helping to reach net zero is recycling. This is mentioned the most by 63% of people now. Of course, recycling is an important contribution to that aspect, but it pales in comparison to some other major actions that we need to do around, for example, decarbonization of heating. So the way public perceives environment around recycling and kind of like more kind of like animal conservation issues, it doesn't necessarily correlate that strongly with the biggest flashpoints from net zero in particular. I think the price point, I think, is something to really reiterate, is because even though there's lots of willingness to support various interventions, once you start getting to ask people if they're willing to pay more for heating, for electricity, we start finding quite a split opinion, and even majority opposition on something like electricity and heating, for example. So consumers are quite sensitive to costs. And I think this is where the demographic split comes into play upon. Groups which are more ambivalent about actions, so conservative voters, leave voters, people with low education qualifications, also people who are more likely to be, many of them are also more likely to be in lower incomes and are much more likely to be sensitive to policy which punishes them in monetary sense. So for policymakers, it is really key to think about action on things like heating, specifically how you make sure that you retain this quite fragile consensus once you start implementing the policies on heating in particular, so for example, subsidies around kind of new ways of heating houses. And I think, conscious as I'm kind of running out of time, I think the heating issue in particular is also an information issue. It's not just a cost issue. We find that only 42% of people have heard of heat pumps, for example, in our polling. And so any kind of replacement of heating at homes has a long uphill climb, and it's important for businesses and for governments to address basically every aspect of concerns that were raised. So I think, kind of to conclude on my point, that there's lots to be positive about, and there's lots of things to build upon for government and businesses on our way to achieve net zero. But it's really, really vital to think about the sensitivity towards costs and prices for those interventions, and making sure that low-income groups in particular do not have to burden that cost accessory, which will likely raise significant opposition to these matters.
That's great. Thank you, Anvar. And finally, we are going to hear from Megan Trethewey, who is the head of programs at the Conservative Environment Network.
Thanks so much, Emma. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of approach and the receptiveness, and sort of where I think there are several things that will be key to taking the public with us on this journey to net zero, which a lot of us have already sort of touched on. I think, firstly, the government has taken the right approach in its sort of positive framing of net zero. It's much easier to get people on board when we're talking about opportunity and carrots rather than sticks. And we know that the public is with us on the principle of tackling climate change, but I think how you talk about it really does matter. And we saw them push back against Extinction Rebellion, sort of because their messaging seems very negative. And obviously that has a place within a protest movement, but it can also seriously turn people off the idea if it means sort of doom either way. And the Prime Minister sort of set out his alternative vision for the green industrial revolution that will bring jobs to all corners of the UK, and sort of set net zero out as a prize in itself, a nicer place to live, where streets are lined with trees and homes are warmer and cheaper to run, where you have more choice on how to get to work rather than less. And this sort of positive agenda, I think, makes it easier for the public to back our approach and be receptive to it. And similarly, we should be sort of trumpeting the benefits of those clean technologies, as well as making it easier to switch to them. With that being said, obviously there are difficult conversations that need to be had, as many of the others have talked about, and the key theme for all of that is really information sharing. The Climate Assembly responded broadly positively when they had the issues clearly set out to them. And if we're going to maintain public support, then we really need to start having those conversations now with a sustained information campaign. For example, the Bright Blue polling sort of looked into this, but how many people know that their boiler is contributing to climate change? And how much time do we really have to crack on with sorting that out if we're going to reach net zero by 2050? So we've had sort of getting ready for Brexit, the big campaign to share information, and now we need get ready for net zero. And if we explain the context to people, I think we'll be much more likely to bring them with us rather than attempting to impose solutions on them top down. And in that sort of context, there is a real key role for local authorities, I think, who have shown their enthusiasm through their local climate emergency motions. And we should really be tapping into that more, using their community networks to share ideas, and also acknowledging that they are really great microcosms to test some of these solutions. And the will is really there if the government will fund them to trial their innovative ideas. They know their communities best. We've already seen some of that with a 10-point plan hydrogen town, for example, but maybe there'd be more scope to trial things like a citywide road pricing scheme and so on. And then we can sort of see how those communities react and gather feedback on a smaller scale. On responsibility, I also think we should be talking about the role of civil society and charities and NGOs in this as well. We do a lot of work with various NGOs in this sphere, and I think they have a really important role as information sources alongside the government, given that they will appeal to different audiences. But it's really important that they sort of broaden their role to try to reach out to everyone. It's really hard for the government to begin conversations on decarbonising home heating, for example, from scratch, and try to convince everyone that it's a really good idea if they've never heard of it. Similarly, it's hard for MPs to stick their hands and try to campaign for something if think tankers are the only ones sort of telling them to do it. Their constituents' views really matter to them. And so civil society should be trying to reach out to everyone and not just energize their own followers, but working with government to explain net zero in a bit more detail and what it will entail. I sort of started this year a bit more excited, given that we had 5 years of a Conservative government with a strong majority that stood on a pledge to reach net zero. And we'd have the stability that we needed to have some of these longer term conversations and to implement those strategies. And obviously coronavirus has derailed that to a point, but at the same time, it hasn't. The minister and his team have forged ahead with a lot of these great strategies that are too many to mention right now, but that are hopefully coming out soon. And these are all now in the context of the green recovery. And the climate outreach segmentation work that was recently published showed that there's no section of society that wants to go back to normal after the pandemic. They really do believe in sort of building back better, whatever that may mean. And so I think there really is an opportunity here for this government to start having those conversations, to bring the public with us, and to start to paint in their minds this vision for what we have now, for how net zero might impact us, but also how it will benefit their daily lives. And I think having those honest conversations as soon as possible is really vital to bringing the public with us on this.
That's great. Thanks so much, Megan. It's a shame that we had to lose the minister before he had a chance to hear you say it. All right, well, we have some time now to go to questions, and you can still ask questions via Slido using the code NET0. The first one, I'm going to kind of get this out of the way. It's the inevitable hydrogen question. So I'm going to ask Richard, it's a question from Simon. Should we gamble on green hydrogen solving on gas heat, or should we be starting on a pathway for retrofitting with heat pumps right now in case hydrogen doesn't work?
It's a good question. I mean, thinking about the hydrogen side specifically, there will be questions in people's minds about how fast this can scale up. So we have a target in the 10-point plan now for 5 gigawatts of electrolyzer production, and that's significant, but that won't get us all the way there. We've looked at hydrogen in a lot of detail at Aurora, and it could play, in certain scenarios, it could play a massive role in our overall decarbonisation efforts for hydrogen use in heating, but also in industry and heavy duty transport, as well as in a sort of symbiotic relationship with the power sector, so with electrolyzers, but also hydrogen CCGTs or peaking technologies. It could play a massive role. It could be a sort of 500 terawatt hour size of market overall, which is kind of bigger than our power sector overall. I don't think we can do that if the hydrogen production is from so-called green hydrogen or electrolyzer production only. We would need to get to that scale using a mix of different hydrogen sources, including both green hydrogen from power, but also blue hydrogen from gas and thermal reforming processes. That's the only way we would see such a large, widespread rollout of hydrogen, is if we are open-minded about those various different production routes. I think the UK is open-minded about that and tends to be more technology agnostic. I would contrast the UK's approach there with countries like Germany that have already very much set themselves off down a path of being about renewables derived hydrogen only. And so for context, carbon capture and storage is banned completely in most German regions, whereas in the UK, the UK government is very much in favour of the use of CCS. So I do see a pathway for hydrogen and where it could be a big part of the mix, but the only way to do that is by having diversity of sort of production sources. Is that an easier way forward than switching towards electric heating? I mean, that is a great question, which is sort of the second part of the question that was posed. I think, I can't remember who said it already, but maybe it was Tony. I think the overall system cost of progressing down an electrified route versus a hydrogen focused route, the system cost is pretty similar overall when you wrap in the cost of production, the network cost, the cost of the installations in homes. It actually works out to be a quite similar number. I remember I did research of my own in think tank land at Policy Exchange on this topic back in 2015, 2016, in a report called Too Hot to Handle, which was my comment on this as a policy area. It's a bit difficult for politicians to touch this one. We found that the system cost of those options was very, very similar. But I think to Tony's point, the acceptability from the public end of hydrogen may be higher because it's less of a change from what they have at the moment. And it would still provide heat that you can switch on quickly. And you don't have to fit a heat pump to the side of your house or dig up your garden to put in a ground source heat pump. So it's kind of less disruptive in a sense to the home to switch towards hydrogen than it is a heat pump. For that reason, I think hydrogen could work. It won't work everywhere. It will, by definition, it's limited by where we have a gas grid. And even then, I think it will be, in some areas, it could be really successful, in others, not. Having said all of that, rolling out hydrogen is still not easy, as I'm sure Tony will know. It's a massive infrastructure challenge, a huge coordination challenge. The idea of switching over whole cities towards hydrogen heating is not for the faint-hearted. But yeah, it still might be easier than switching to 100% electric heating. It might be. Maybe we'll see a mix of solutions, different solutions in different areas. That's probably the most plausible answer.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, one thing I kind of wonder when we talk about the ease of doing hydrogen now is, of course, that when we do something that's easy now, but might not be, and I'm not coming down either side, might not be the best in the long run, what we see is that eventually when people are told that actually their choices were the wrong choices, then that tends to kind of have a bit of a backlash. Was there anyone who wanted to kind of come back on that, Tony?
Yeah, I'll chip in. So I think Richard's answer was terrific. You know, kind of agree with most of, if not all of what he says. I think, you know, blue hydrogen is going to be more important than green in the short term. I don't. Yeah, there was in the question, there's a gamble. I don't think we're gambling on hydrogen. We need to explore hydrogen as a feasible option, but it's more likely to be blue than green. And there are kind of two principal sides of the equation. We've got to get the production right through industrial clusters, and then we've got to get the customer side of it right in the sense of it's safe, technically feasible, and all the rest of it. I think in terms of the customer piece, I think, you know, heat pumps are a terrific piece of technology, and, you know, they're very efficient in terms of, you know, turning green energy into heating the home, but they're not going to work everywhere. And, you know, there's certain housing stock where it's going to be really, really difficult to get heat pumps in, whether you can get district heating networks into those places as well. So a lot of the work that we're now doing is that kind of regional planning of understanding where heat pumps are going to be most effective and where hydrogen is going to be most effective. And of course, we've got, you know, the next 2 to 5 years are going to be crucial in kind of understanding the safety, the technical case, and as Richard points out, how you're going to do that transition from one fuel source to another. It's not going to happen overnight. blending is going to be the critical thing within that. To start with, we've been doing successful trials at Keele University where we can blend up to 20% of hydrogen. We need more extensive trials there, while in parallel we're looking at 100% hydrogen, and then the things will come together, you know, over the course of the next decade, where, you know, hopefully the technical, the safety case, the economic case is made, and you'll then see 100% hydrogen. You know, and the government have signalled this, you know, the hydrogen town as being a thing that we should look to by 2030. So that would be a good, you know, a good thing to target. You know, we're super keen on obviously delivering against that.
Great, thanks very much. And this is a kind of question that's come up quite a bit. And again, I kind of wish the minister was here as well to discuss it, but maybe one for Megan. The Climate Assembly, which obviously covered all kind of shades of opinion, made some radical proposals and, you know, balancing competing requirements, but is the policy lagging behind the public capacity to change?
I mean, as I said, there are sort of infinite number of strategies due out pretty soon that will probably move a lot of the dial on this, and the 10-point plan in itself was quite a big chunk of policy, and we're obviously still waiting for the detail on some of that as well. So yeah, I certainly think, as I mentioned, there's a big desire to make a step change now, and I think they've responded quite quickly on some of the changes, for example, on walking and cycling and so on, to try and grasp some of those changes. But I certainly think as we're spending more time in our home, more people moving to remote working, they're certainly going to start noticing their heating bills more, and I think becoming more engaged in their suppliers and what meter might make. And I think it'll be interesting to see some of those trends and how we can respond to that. But yeah, I think I can imagine that you know, BEIS in particular is looking at a lot of the strategies that may have been just about ready to go and having to rethink quite a bit based on what's happened in the last few months, which in a way might, you know, be a sort of rocket to even further change.
Can I just come in on that as well? So, I mean, I think the challenge, of course, is that the Citizens Assembly, which I'm a big fan of, I think it's great, is an opportunity for people to spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. And I think the challenge is, as kind of these kind of surveys recognize, is that most people don't spend all that much time thinking about these issues. So I think it's very difficult to talk about a public appetite, or that public is ahead of policymakers. I mean, clearly there's some in the public who are very keen on this transition, and there's others who haven't thought about it very much and seem kind of inclined towards it. But that's a very different group. So I think it is not a danger, but it's a challenge to extrapolate the findings of the Citizens Assembly to all citizens.
But that kind of leads on to one of our other questions that has been posed, which is what can be done to educate the general population? Is it something that we should be kind of introducing into the core national curriculum? I mean, Megan's idea of the Get Ready for Net Zero campaign might be one thing, but I wondered if anyone else, what role do you see kind of education is having in the pathway to net zero?
Can I just quickly comment both on the previous question, but also a bit on this one? I think I'll probably quite agree with David that I think actually, because people haven't really thought that much about net zero and thought about the cost of facing them, actually, if you were to confront them with the changes they might need to make, for example, around the heating system, actually you might get a kind of initial pushback or maybe perhaps an unpleasant surprise from them. So pleasant surprise from the cost and this kind of. And of course, this is where kind of like the difference in settings comes in. If you're like kind of like a voter who's motivated by green issues, and perhaps you would the understanding of this kind of like increased cost, but if you're not a voter who's kind of like engaged in green politics or not kind of like environmental and in a fundamental ways, and you're probably going to like be pretty unpleasantly surprised, and probably it's and that's an easy way to produce significant opposition to something, I think, that lack of expectations. So I think policymakers can move that quickly, really, despite what some of the data is showing. And I think on the education, I think it's kind of like a tricky point, because so much of like, because people don't spend that much thinking about it, conceptions on environmental issues are still so much fixing the public mind among things like recycling and conservation, which are obviously very important issues, but not in themselves net zero related and the challenge. So I think shifting that perception in the public eye is really really key.
Thanks. Yeah, Megan?
Yeah, I think on the education piece, I think mostly it's the young people who seem to know a lot about this. So maybe not so much focus on education, but I think your role, Emma, and others sort of in the press on raising these issues regularly and keeping people up to date on what's coming down the pipeline and what this all really means. And also, as I mentioned, NGOs, I think a lot of the time I have conversations with them about what they're writing into government about, but I also think, well, have you even talked about this with your massive mailing list, and what do they think about this? And if you've not got a Greenpeace supporter knocking on your door for heat pumps, then I think the MP is sort of thinking that people don't really want them. I mean, not that a Greenpeace supporter is necessarily representative of all their constituents, but if you get what I mean. And similarly, the local authorities, they're having a lot of these engagement campaigns ahead of their local climate emergency motions, and we're really encouraging our MPs ahead of COP26 to be hosting local climate summits and just trying to bring COP to a bit more of a local level and talk with your constituents about what it really means and what it will mean for them and what they actually think about this. So yeah, I think you're right that there's a difference, and certainly cost will be a huge impact on them. But I think if you're sort of telling them that over the long term, a more energy efficient home where you sort of purchase heat as a service, or you're looking at a different, more tech savvy approach, I think more people can get excited about that if you're really explaining it to them in a way that they can understand.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that kind of stuck out from me from the kind of bright blue polling, so 58% of people don't think it's credible that we're going to reach our net zero goals. But I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on why that matters, why we need people to believe in this.
Could I come in on the previous question?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, to me, you were talking about on the previous one, talking about the need for more education on this. To me, I actually see that there's a huge amount of education and engagement on this issue through the media, the newspapers, but also the TV. I was watching Country File last night with their Plant Britain campaign. That's huge. I mean, the entire program was about the need to address climate change, and I mean, very specific idea there around planting hundreds of thousands of trees. I think you'd be hard pressed to miss that this is something that people need to think about. I think for the general population at large, they do get it, and the awareness of this issue has gone through the roof in recent years. To me, though, the challenge is that you can talk to people about stuff, and they will do the easier things, and they will put insulation in their lofts. They will plant trees. Those are things that people can sort of grapple with and implement relatively easily. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're about to change the much more difficult things. So the whole house retrofit, the putting in of a new heating system that costs the best part of £10,000. To me, that needs to be about getting the incentives right, and it needs to be about targeted government support in the right areas. Probably the elephant in the room in this whole debate about heating is the fact that gas heating is pretty cheap. There's 5% VAT on residential gas use, and there's no carbon tax. So it is cheap heat source. That's what people know and understand. They know that it's cheap. And so switching to anything other than that is almost by definition going to be more expensive. So to some extent, that's why it's been impossible for politicians, policymakers to change that. To date, it's been very, very, very hard. And the idea, I mean, in endless think tank papers, there is a suggestion, including my own, increase the VAT on gas and it will push people towards lower carbon heating. It's like, great in theory, very, very hard in practice for a politician to grab hold of that and think, yes, that's going to win me votes. So if we're not going to do that, what is the alternative? How do we actually get there? I think you can get there partly through regulation, by banning certain things. So declaring an end date where new homes will no longer have gas boilers. Okay, that's again probably the easier bit because you're not addressing the existing stock. I mean, maybe we do need to tackle the VAT thing head on, but also compensate for it in another way. I saw actually interestingly in the Citizens Assembly, that question was asked very directly. Would you support an increase on VAT on gas? And actually there was more support for it than I thought there would be. And there was a majority in favour of it, in fact. So at some point, the politicians probably need to grapple with that one, but it just doesn't feel like a vote winner to me.
So I think there's some tricky kind of education in inverted commas issues, because customers' awareness of this issue, as we picked up on, is low. So there's a bit of education. We've got to take customers with us. I mean, this sounds a bit kind of overly promoting hydrogen maybe, but we replace 1.6 to 1.7 million gas boilers every year. So if you can get a hydrogen ready boiler, which the likes of Baxi and Worcester Bosch are saying that they'll be ready to go into production at a very similar price point, then that transition is going to be a whole lot easier. Now, I don't think nevertheless it's going to be easy, because people will inevitably want choice about their heating systems, but there's an element of planning the local heating systems to determine what's going to work where. So I think there's some kind of tricky issues down the track when it comes to implementation of these things, of do we prevent people from having one energy source to another or not? What if somebody wants to stick with their gas boiler, but we can't get hydrogen to them? As Richard says, there won't, hydrogen is probably not going to be everywhere in the network. There'll be areas of the network where it makes sense to have heat pumps. So I think some real tricky issues. We've got to take public along with us. We've got to educate them. I don't quite know how we get to in terms of the amount of choice that they get and all the rest of it, but we'll kind of cross that bridge when we get to it.
Can I get back to maybe your credibility question, Emma?
Yes, please.
So, I mean, I think this is kind of related to that, to Tony's point as well. I mean, I think, if you would have asked, all of us who pretend to be energy policy experts 5 years ago or 10 years ago, what the fate of offshore wind would be, I don't think you would have found the belief that that it would have performed as well as it has. The cost would have fallen as rapidly as they have. So I would, in many ways, kind of take the whole question of credibility as well as the whole question as to kind of the overall generalized enthusiasm for net zero with a bit of a pinch of salt. I think the real question is closer to what Richard was talking about and so on, and Tony, is that we need to get on with it, which is to talk about very significant ramp up of heat pump incentives, of increasing production of blue and green hydrogen. Without that, you're not going to really be able to gauge both on the cost side or in terms of the public acceptability side. So there really is a lot to do, right? Right now it's very, very niche. And it's only if you kind of make much more substantial efforts, which will inevitably, involve, I think the 10-point plan is a great start, but that's just very much a down payment. I mean, there's kind of tenfold increase in effort and ambition that's really needed.
Great. I mean, another specific question that has come through, which might be one for you, David, is what support, and perhaps is there enough support for small businesses and tradespeople, I guess, in the energy sector, with re-education, or are they at risk of being forgotten? Are we training apprentices today for what we need tomorrow?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I'm involved a bit in advising the Industrial Decarbonization Challenge, and one of the big things for each of these regional clusters that they need to get their heads around is not just the big players in these clusters, but the SMEs. And then, if we relate it back to heating, I mean, I think there's a huge amount of work that would need to be done by small business, and how much are they bought in to this as well. I think, I was asking for advice from my company that does gas boiler servicing as to alternatives, and his attitude was, let's just wait around for as Richard was saying, the mandate. Your boiler's fine, your house is fine, don't do anything, just wait around for something to happen. So I think that's the other question of how do you get these SMEs to feel engaged with this kind of wider net zero ambition.
If I might just come in quickly, skills is a pet interest of mine, because I just think even if we tried to go for net zero tomorrow, we just don't have the people to physically install all the charge points and the heat pumps and so on. And I think there's no better way to get people excited about it than to give them the skills and help people train in some of these industries where there's going to be a job there. I mean, we need them to get to 2050, so it's such a huge exciting opportunity. And if young people are so excited about action on climate change, then let's give them some green apprenticeships. I think it's hugely important. And they're going to talk to their parents about how they've installed a heat pump down the road, and maybe they should have one too. And I think that's sort of a good way there. And the government's Green Jobs Task Force that was set up sort of is going to be looking at this. But yeah, there's certainly a huge gap. There's a very small number of mechanics that even know how to look at how to give an MOT on an electric vehicle. How are we going to address a lot of that? So certainly think there's a big opportunity there to really rocket boost a lot of these skills, and similarly with sort of transitioning workers over from other industries and so on, and supporting them to have a lot of skills breadth there.
That's great, thank you. And I guess we'll have to end on that positive note of opportunity. So I want to thank Bright Blue and Cadent Gas for organising this event, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us. And I've been asked to let you know that people can sign up to become a member of Bright Blue by visiting the Bright Blue website. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, bye.